The sweet shop's last customer, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Bell Above the Door. The bell above the door of the Sugar Twist did not ring on the Tuesday evening it mattered most, because no one came in to make it ring, and no one came out either. It was Constable Yardley who noticed, and only because he happened to be walking his usual round past the shop at 6:30, later than he generally went, on account of the fog. The window ought to have gone dark by then. Instead, the gas lamp inside was still burning, low and yellow, throwing the shapes of jars, barley sugar, aniseed balls, pear drops, long and strange across the ceiling. He tried the door. It was not locked. Miss Hester Quill was behind her own counter, seated on her high stool as she always sat, her hands folded in her lap, as though she were merely resting her eyes before the next customer. A cup of tea, quite cold, stood at her elbow. The little brass bell that hung above the door, the one that rang for every soul who came to buy a twist of humbugs or post a parcel to a son in Aden or a daughter in Leeds, had not made a sound in perhaps 40 minutes, and would not have made one at all had Constable Yardley not been obliged, 3 times, to push the door rather harder than he liked, because Miss Quill's foot, fallen from the stool, was wedged against it. She was quite dead, and on the counter before her, half wrapped in its twist of white paper, sat a single humbug, uneaten. By the time Miss Jane Marple heard of it, over breakfast, from her niece Prue Hartnell, who had married a solicitor and moved to Hollowmere 3 years before, and was, in consequence, obliged to know everyone's business as a professional courtesy, the fog had not yet lifted, and the village had already settled on its verdict. "Her heart, they're saying," said Prue, buttering toast with the brisk unconcern of a woman discussing someone else's roof repairs. She was 61, after all, and always did look a little grey about the mouth. "Dr. Enderby's looking into it, though I can't think what there is to look into. Poor old Hester. I shall miss her humbugs dreadfully. No one else stocks the proper sharp kind." "Was she found in the shop?" Miss Marple asked, not looking up from her own toast, though something in the set of her white head had gone very still. "On her stool, if you please, as though she'd simply drifted off between customers. Constable Yardley found her. Dreadfully unpleasant for him, I should think, being new to the position and all." Prue reached for the marmalade. "Do have some of this, Aunt Jane. It's the cottage kind, not shop-bought. Mrs. Dance from the rectory makes it." But Miss Marple was thinking, not of marmalade, but of the fact that Hester Quill, whom she had met only twice, once buying stamps and once buying wool, and had found on both occasions to be a woman of exact and orderly habits, the sort who wound her till draws coins by denomination and swept her step at precisely 8:30, had died sitting upright at her counter with a humbug left unwrapped upon it. An orderly woman does not leave a sweet half-wrapped. She finishes what she begins, or she does not begin it at all. The village of Hollowmere lay in a fold of the Norfolk fens where the mist came up off the dykes most autumn evenings, and sat over the rooftops like a held breath, so that by 4 in the afternoon the church tower was only a suggestion, and by 5 the far end of the high street had vanished altogether. It was not a large village. 1 street, a green, a church with a squat Norman tower, a public house called the Sluice Gate, and some 24 cottages scattered along the lanes that ran off toward the water meadows. The Sugar Twist stood at the elbow of the high street, where it bent toward the church, and had for 11 years combined, in the manner of many such village shops, the functions of confectioner and sub-post office, so that a person might purchase a quarter of bull's-eyes and post a telegram to Australia in the same transaction, paid for from the same worn leather purse. Miss Marple, walking down that street on the Wednesday morning, with her niece's dog on a lead she did not entirely trust herself to manage, found the shop's blind drawn and a small crowd of villagers standing at a respectful distance from the door, murmuring. "Her heart," said one woman to another, with the particular satisfaction people reserve for tragedies safely filed away. "She never did look well after the summer." "I heard it was her nerves," said a second. "She'd not been herself since her nephew came back." Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the most useful place to stand at any village tragedy was precisely where she could hear two women disagree, stood a little closer and waited. Chapter 2. What the Village Decided. By Thursday, the story had acquired the comfortable fixedness of a thing everyone has agreed to believe, which is not at all the same thing as a thing that is true. Miss Hester Quill, the village had decided, had died of her heart, brought on perhaps by the shock and worry of her nephew's return that August, after 9 years away, first at sea, then, some said, in trouble of one kind or another in Portsmouth, and by the general strain of running a shop and a post office single-handed at 61. It was sad, but it was the sort of sad that closed itself up neatly, like a shop shutting for the night, and required nothing further from anyone. Dr. Enderby, the young locum who had been standing in for old Dr. Frayne since the spring, while Frayne recovered from a broken hip in Cromer, was less content to let it close. "I don't like it," he said to Constable Yardley, in the back room of the shop where Hester Quill's account books were still spread across her small desk, exactly as she had left them. "There's a smell to it that oughtn't to be there. Bitter almonds, or near enough. I've sent word to the coroner in Lynn. There'll have to be a post-mortem. Poison, sir?" Yardley, who was not yet 30 and had come to Hollowmere only that spring from a larger and less mysterious posting in Ipswich, looked as though he did not entirely welcome the word. "I don't know yet, but I'll say this much. A woman doesn't die sitting bolt upright with her hands folded like she's waiting for the vicar. Not from her heart. Not usually. And there's the tea." Enderby nodded toward the cold cup still standing, untouched now by anyone but the police photographer, upon the counter. "I'd like that analysed too, if you can manage it without half the village knowing before Friday." It could not, of course, be managed without half the village knowing, because Mrs. Dance, the rectory's cook, had a cousin who did for the coroner's clerk in King's Lynn, and by Saturday morning the word poison had made its way back to Hollowmere, dressed up, as such words generally are by the time they have travelled through 6 mouths, in considerably more colour than it had left with. "Arsenic," said Mrs. Dance to Miss Marple, over the low stone wall that divided the rectory garden from the lane, with the confiding relish of a woman handing over a particularly fine plum. "In her tea, if you please." Someone sat there and watched her drink it, or near enough. "Did they indeed?" said Miss Marple, and went on pruning the late roses with an attention that gave nothing at all away. It was on the Sunday, after church, that Miss Marple first had proper occasion to observe the small company of people whose lives had touched, in one way or another, upon the counter of the sugar twist, for grief, in a village, does not stay decently at home. It comes out to church, and stands about afterward on the porch steps, discussing the weather with its eyes elsewhere. There was Ivy Coswell first, Hester Quill's niece and shop assistant these past 6 years, a slight, fair girl of perhaps 24, with the particular stillness of someone who has trained herself not to be noticed. She stood a little apart from the others in a grey coat too heavy for the mild morning, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, and when the rector pressed her hand and murmured his condolences, she thanked him in a voice so quiet that Miss Marple, 3 feet away, had to lean to catch it. There was Roger Quill, the returned nephew. No, Miss Marple corrected herself, listening more closely. He was Hester's nephew, by her late husband's side. Not blood kin at all, a broad sunburnt man of 30-odd, with restless hands, and the look of someone perpetually listening for a step behind him. He had come back to Hollowmere in August, after 9 years at sea, and, by all accounts, some trouble in Portsmouth that no one described more precisely than trouble, and had been living, since his return, in his aunt's spare room above the shop. There was Mrs. Averil Bryce, the doctor's wife, old Dr. Frayne's wife that was, not young Enderby's, for Enderby was unmarried, a handsome, anxious woman of 40, who ran the Flower Rota and the Women's Institute, and, it was generally agreed, ran her invalid husband's household besides, and who had been, Miss Marple gathered from the murmured talk on the porch, one of Hester Quill's oldest friends in the village, closer to her than anyone else living. There was Mr. Silas Trent, the bank clerk from the Lynn branch who lodged at the sluice gate and had been seen, more than once, arguing in low voices with Hester Quill about some matter of an overdue account. There was Miss Prudence Alcott, a spinster of independent means who had chaired the Garden Society for 11 years running, and had, this very autumn, found herself for the first time seriously challenged for the position by Hester Quill, of all unlikely candidates, who had put herself forward in September with a determination that had surprised everyone, including, it seemed, herself. And there was the choir mistress, Miss Ruth Pargeter, a thin, sharp-featured woman who had taught the village children their hymns for 20 years, and who alone, of the whole gathering, did not come forward to speak of Hester Quill at all, but stood by the lich gate with her hymn book pressed to her chest, watching the others with an expression Miss Marple found, on later reflection, considerably more interesting than grief. "Such a sad thing," said Prue Hartnell, taking her aunt's arm as they left the churchyard, "though I don't know why everyone looks so very careful about it. Poor Hester wasn't a woman anyone could dislike, surely." "My dear Prue," said Miss Marple mildly, watching Ivy Coswell walk away alone down the lane, her grey coat pulling tight against the wind, "I have generally found that the women nobody could dislike are very often the women about whom nobody troubles to ask a single question. It is only when they die that we discover how little we actually knew." Chapter 3. The Locked Drawer. The inquest was opened on Monday and adjourned within the hour, as inquiries generally are when the coroner has been given, by the analyst in King's Lynn, a report that raises considerably more than it settles. Miss Hester Quill, it was now certain, had died of poisoning, not arsenic, as the village gossip had it, but a preparation of aconitine, extracted, the analyst believed, from the root of monkshood, a plant that grew, as it happened, in a great many Hollowmere gardens, including, Miss Marple noted with interest, the shaded border along the north wall of the rectory garden, and also, rather more strikingly, in the small bed behind the sugar twist itself, where Hester Quill had grown flowers for as long as anyone could remember, more from habit than from any great love of gardening. The poison, the analyst was fairly confident, had been administered in her tea, taken, as she took it every evening at 5:30, alone in the shop after Ivy Coswell had gone home for the day, which left, as Inspector Bagshaw, sent down from Norwich once the word poison made the case too large for Constable Yardley alone, was obliged to point out at some length to a small gathering in the shop's back room on the Tuesday one question that mattered rather more than any other. Who made her tea? It was Ivy Coswell who answered, sitting very upright in the hard chair the inspector had set for her, her hands folded in her lap in an unconscious echo. Miss Marple thought of the way her aunt had been found. "I did, Inspector. Every evening, before I go, I put the kettle on at 4:30 and make it up at 5:30, exactly when she likes it." Liked it, she corrected herself, and her voice did not waver, though her hands, Miss Marple noticed, tightened very slightly upon each other. "And where does the tea come from? The caddy on the shelf there?" "Yes, sir, the same tin we've always used." "And the water, from the kettle, boiled in this room?" "Yes, sir." "And you left the shop when?" "At 20 to 6. I always do. My aunt liked to close up alone, do the till, that sort of thing. She said it settled her nerves to have the last half hour to herself." Bagshaw made a note, unhurried, and Miss Marple, sitting a little apart from the proceedings in the chair Prue had somehow contrived to secure her, for Prue's husband, being the family's solicitor, gave Miss Marple a claim to be present that nobody troubled to question, found herself looking not at Ivy Coswell's face, which gave away admirably little, but at the small writing desk in the corner of the room, where Hester Quill's account books lay still spread open, and beneath them, just visible, the corner of a wooden drawer. The drawer was not quite shut, and more than that, its lock, a small brass thing of the kind fitted to writing desks the country over, hung loose from one screw, as though it had been forced, not gently, and not very long ago. "Inspector," said Miss Marple, when there came a pause in which it seemed permissible to speak, "I wonder whether anyone has yet had occasion to look into that desk drawer." Bagshaw glanced at it, then at her, with the faint, practiced patience of a man who has learned that elderly ladies at inquests are sometimes worth humouring and sometimes not. "We've been through the desk, madam. Account books, correspondence, the usual. Nothing of interest." "I did not ask whether it had been searched," said Miss Marple, with the gentlest possible firmness. "I asked whether anyone had noticed that the lock had been broken. Recently, I should think. The wood around the screw is still quite pale where it has been forced, you see, not yet darkened by the air. A very small thing, but Miss Quill, from everything I have heard of her, was not a woman who would have left a broken lock unamended for more than a day, let alone gone on locking a drawer whose lock no longer caught." There was a silence in the small back room, broken only by the tick of the shop clock through the connecting door, and Miss Marple was aware, without quite turning her head to look, that Ivy Coswell's folded hands had gone entirely still. Chapter 4. A Cup Too Cold. It was raining by Wednesday, a fine, persistent Fenland rain that turned the fog into something greyer and wetter, but no less concealing, and Miss Marple, who had announced to her niece over breakfast that she thought she might call upon Mrs. Bryce about the flower rota, found herself instead, an hour later, taking tea in Averil Bryce's comfortable, cluttered drawing-room, the flower rota mentioned only once, briefly, and abandoned by mutual and unspoken consent in favour of the subject that lay, as it lay over the whole village now, considerably closer to hand. "I still can't credit it," Averil Bryce said, turning her cup in its saucer without drinking from it. "Hester and I have knew each other, for 15 years, since before I married Henry even. She was the first person in this village who was properly kind to me when I came as a bride and knew no one." Her hand, Miss Marple observed, was not entirely steady. Who could possibly have wanted to hurt her? She didn't have an enemy in the world. "And yet," said Miss Marple, "someone put aconitine into her tea, which does rather suggest, does it not, that somebody wanted to hurt her a very great deal indeed. One does not go to the trouble of extracting poison from a monkshood root for a person one merely dislikes a little." Mrs. Bryce's cup rattled faintly against its saucer. "I suppose not. I understand you and she had grown rather close again this autumn," Miss Marple went on, in the same mild, unhurried tone she might have used to discuss the likelihood of frost. "Mrs. Dance mentioned that you had taken to calling at the shop most evenings, just before closing. Did she?" It was not quite a question. Averil Bryce set down her cup with rather more care than the small sound of china against china required. "Yes, we had. Hester and I. There were things we needed to discuss that autumn. Old things. Nothing that has any bearing on this." "Old things very often do have a bearing, in my experience," said Miss Marple gently. "It is generally the things people are most certain have no bearing that turn out, on examination, to have the most bearing of all. But I did not come to press you, my dear, only to say that if there is something weighing on you, a fresh pair of eyes, even an old woman's eyes, can sometimes see a burden more clearly than the person carrying it." Averil Bryce looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face, grief or fear, or both together, seemed to waver on the edge of speech. Then, from the hall, came the sound of the front door, and Dr. Frayne's uneven step upon the boards, and whatever she had been on the point of saying folded itself away again, as neatly as a letter put back in its envelope. "You'll forgive me, Miss Marple," she said instead, rising. "Henry tires easily since his hip. I ought to see him settled." Miss Marple, gathering her gloves, reflected, as she walked back down the lane in the thinning rain, past the dark windows of the Sugar Twist with its police notice pasted crookedly to the door, that Mrs. Bryce had said nothing that has any bearing on this, with the particular emphasis of a woman convincing herself rather than her listener. And there was, besides, the cup, Hester Quill's cup, found cold upon the counter, with perhaps 2/3 of its contents undrunk. A woman who took her tea alone, as Ivy Coswell had said, from 5:30 until she chose to close, a woman of exact habits, who wound her coin drawer by denomination and swept her step at 8:30, did not, Miss Marple thought, ordinarily let her tea go entirely cold beside her without either finishing it or pouring it away, unless something, in those final minutes, had stopped her from doing either. Unless, indeed, someone had been sitting there with her. Chapter 5. The Bank Clerk's Debt. Mr. Silas Trent was not a man who welcomed visitors to his corner table at the sluice gate, least of all an elderly lady he had never properly been introduced to. But Miss Marple had long ago discovered that the surest way into a reluctant conversation was to arrive already halfway through one. "I understand you had dealings with Miss Quill," she said, settling herself into the chair opposite him with the unhurried certainty of a woman who did not expect to be refused regarding some matter of an account. "It must have been a great worry to you, her dying so suddenly, with the question left unsettled." Trent, a narrow, sallow man of perhaps 35 with ink-stained fingers and the permanently harried look of a man who adds figures for a living and finds they never quite add up in his own favour, set down his glass rather harder than the question warranted. "I don't know what you've heard, madam, but there was nothing improper in it. Miss Quill had lent me a sum of money in the spring, a private matter, nothing to do with the bank, and she'd asked for it back sooner than I could manage. We disagreed about the terms. That's all it was. People don't get murdered over £40 and a fortnight's grace." £40 is a very great deal of money to some people, Miss Marple observed mildly, and a fortnight can feel like no time at all when one has spent what one borrowed and has nothing left to show for it. "Was that the difficulty, Mr. Trent, that you no longer had the money to give back?" The colour that rose in Trent's narrow face was answer enough, though he did not give it in words. "I'd have found it," he said at last, low and stubborn. "I was looking for it. I had no cause to wish her dead. Quite the opposite. A dead woman can't be argued into more time, but a living one sometimes can be. It was in my interest, if you want the plain truth of it, for Hester Quill to go on living a good deal longer. It was," Miss Marple thought, walking back through the thinning fog toward the rectory lane, "a perfectly sensible piece of logic, and very possibly a true one. But she had learned over a great many years of village tea-tables and village tragedies that the people whose motives seemed most sensibly against murder were not thereby proven innocent of it, only that their reasons, if they had done it after all, must lie somewhere she had not yet thought to look. Chapter 6. The Garden Society Vote. The Garden Society met on Thursday afternoons in the church hall, rain or shine, and had done so for as long as Miss Prudence Alcott had chaired it, which was to say, for 11 years, during which time, by her own account, she had brought the society from a scattering of 6 disorganized ladies arguing over dahlias to a body of some 30 members with a proper minute book and an annual show that drew visitors from as far as Lynn. "And then, if you please," said Miss Alcott, pouring tea for Miss Marple, with hands that trembled very slightly, whether from age or agitation it was not immediately clear, "Hester Quill puts herself up against me in September, after 11 years of never once expressing the faintest interest in being chairwoman of anything. I ask you, Miss Marple, 11 years. It must have come as a considerable surprise," Miss Marple said. "Surprise? I was never so astonished in my life. And do you know, she very nearly had the votes for it too. Went about the whole village calling on people she'd scarcely exchanged 2 words with in years, all very quiet and determined about it, not like herself at all. I couldn't make out what had gotten into her." Miss Alcott set down the teapot with a small, sharp click. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I don't mind telling you I was glad when the vote was put off on account of what happened. I'd not have wanted to win it that way, exactly, but I'll admit I'd not have wanted to lose it either, not after all I've built. Does that sound very dreadful of me?" "It sounds," said Miss Marple, "entirely human, which is very rarely the same thing as dreadful. But I wonder, did Miss Quill ever say why she had suddenly taken such an interest? It does seem rather out of character, from everything I have heard of her." Miss Alcott considered this, her sharp face creasing in genuine thought rather than performance. "She said something once, at the last committee meeting before it happened, something about wanting, at her age, to be somebody in this village at last. properly, and not just the woman who sells the humbugs. I thought it an odd thing to say. Hester Quill had run that shop for 11 years and never once complained of being overlooked, not that I ever heard. And then all of a sudden, this autumn, she wanted to be somebody. Miss Alcott shook her head. I still don't know what brought it on. Miss Marple, stirring her tea with a thoughtfulness that had nothing to do with the sugar, found herself turning the phrase over with considerable interest. Somebody in this village at last. It was, she reflected, the sort of thing a woman might say who had recently discovered or recently decided to act upon some fact about her own history that had, until that autumn, kept her content to remain quietly in the background of a life that was not, perhaps, entirely the life she felt herself entitled to. Chapter 7. The choir mistress who did not weep. It was Ruth Pargeter, the choir mistress, whom Miss Marple found hardest to draw into conversation, not because the woman was unwilling to talk. She talked, in fact, a good deal, about the state of the hymn books and the falling attendance at Wednesday practice, and the deplorable behaviour of the youngest dance boy during the psalms, but because she talked around every subject that might have borne upon Hester Quill's death with a fluency that seemed, the longer Miss Marple listened, considerably too practised to be entirely natural. You did not care for Miss Quill, Miss Marple said at last, cutting gently across an extended complaint about the organ bellows, in the tone of a woman remarking upon the weather. Ruth Pargeter's needle, for she had taken up some plain sewing the moment Miss Marple sat down, as though the visit required a defence, stopped quite still. I never said any such thing. No, Miss Marple agreed. You have said a great many things, Miss Pargeter, in the last quarter of an hour, and not one of them has been about Miss Quill at all, which I have generally found to be the surest sign that a person has in fact a great deal to say about her, and has decided not to say it. For a moment the choir mistress's sharp face was still, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but partook of both. We were girls together, she said finally, low, Hester and I. Long before either of us came to Hollowmere, we grew up not 10 miles from here, in Sutton Marsh, though nobody in this village knows that, because Hester never told them, and I never saw fit to correct the impression that we'd only met when she took the shop. We were close once, closer than sisters for a time. She set the sewing down, and then we were not close at all, and I have not troubled to weep over her death, because I stopped mourning the Hester Quill I knew a very long time before somebody put poison in her tea. Does that shock you, Miss Marple? Very little shocks me any longer, said Miss Marple gently, but I wonder whether you would tell me what came between two girls who were once closer than sisters. Ruth Pargeter looked at her for a long moment, and Miss Marple had the distinct impression of a door swinging very nearly open, and then, with visible effort, being shut again. That, said the choir mistress, taking up her needle once more, is a very old story, and it has nothing to do with why she died. I'll thank you for not asking me again, but Miss Marple, walking home in the last grey light of the afternoon, thought that a woman who declares a story to have nothing to do with a murder, entirely unprompted, and with such particular firmness, has very often said a good deal more than she intended. Chapter 8. The Nephew's Account. Roger Quill had taken, since his aunt's death, to sitting alone in the small back room of the shop each evening, going through her account books with the slow, methodical patience of a man for whom counting figures was easier than counting grief, and it was there that Miss Marple found him on the Friday, at the invitation of Ivy Coswell, who had grown, in the past days, into a kind of wary trust of the old lady from the Rectory Lane that she extended to almost no one else. I don't mind telling you the truth, Miss Marple, since half the village has already decided it for themselves and got it wrong, Roger Quill said, not looking up from the ledger before him. I did have trouble in Portsmouth, a matter of a debt I couldn't pay, and a man who didn't care to wait for it. I came here because I'd nowhere else to go, and because Aunt Hester, whatever else she was, never once turned away family, blood or not. She took me in without a single question and gave me the spare room, and never once asked when I meant to move on. That was very good of her, Miss Marple said. It was, And I'll tell you something else, since you've clearly come to ask it eventually, however politely you mean to go about it. I didn't kill her. I'd no cause to. She was the one soul in this village who never once looked at me as though I were something to be swept up after. Whatever debts I brought with me, they died in Portsmouth, not here. He looked up at last, and his weathered face carried, Miss Marple thought, a grief that was entirely genuine, whatever else lay beneath it. But I'll say this much, for what it's worth. She'd changed this autumn, since about September, quieter in some ways, and in others, restless. Writing letters at night I never saw the answers to, going up to the room she keeps locked, the little box room over the shop, more often than I ever knew her to before. I asked her once what she kept in there, and she said, "Nothing you need trouble yourself over, Roger," and that was the end of that. "A locked box room," Miss Marple repeated, very quietly. I've the key now, for what it's worth. Inspector Bagshaw took most everything of interest, but he left the room itself for me to see, being family. I've not had the heart to go through it properly, but there's a trunk in there, an old one, older than anything else in the shop. I don't believe I ever saw her open it above twice in all the years I knew her, and both times this autumn. Miss Marple, sitting very still in the small back room with the shop clock ticking through the wall and the cold autumn light falling grey through the window, felt something in the case shift, very quietly, into a shape she had not quite seen before, a shape involving a locked drawer forced open, and a locked box room seldom visited until September, and a quiet woman who had suddenly wanted, at 61, to be somebody in the village at last. "I wonder, Mr. Quill," she said, "whether you would allow me to see that trunk." Chapter 9. The Empty Frame. The box room over the shop smelled of camphor and old paper, and had plainly not been swept in some while, though the trunk itself, when Roger Quill lifted its lid, showed no dust at all upon the hasp, only a thin bright scratch where a key had lately been turned, and turned again. "She kept it locked even from me," Roger said, standing back to let Miss Marple look. "I've the spare key from her ring, but I've never once had cause to use it before this week." The trunk held, in its upper tray, a wedding photograph of a solemn young couple Miss Marple did not recognise, a christening gown yellowed with age, and a small bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, the direction on the topmost one written in a hand that was unmistakably younger than the Hester Quill the village had known, rounder and less careful, the hand of a girl rather than a woman. Beneath the letters, tucked into a fold of tissue paper, lay a small hinged frame of tarnished silver, the sort meant to hold a single photograph no larger than a playing card. It was empty. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, turning it over in her gloved fingers. The hinge was stiff with disuse, but the felt lining inside showed, quite clearly, the pale rectangular ghost of where a photograph had rested for a very long time before being removed. Removed recently, she thought, for the felt beneath the ghost mark was still a shade darker than the felt around it, not yet faded by exposure to the light. "There ought to be a photograph in it," she said. "The impression is quite fresh. Someone has taken it out, and not very long ago at all." Roger frowned, turning over the topmost letter without opening it, as though the mere act of reading his aunt's private words felt, even now, like trespass. "I don't understand any of it. Who's the girl in that hand, if it isn't Aunt Hester's own writing as I always knew it?" "I rather think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that it is Miss Quill's own writing after all, from a very great many years before you knew her, when she was scarcely more than a girl herself, and had not yet learned to write the careful, upright hand of a woman who keeps a shop and a post office, and cannot afford to be thought careless of anything." She set the empty frame down with great gentleness upon the tissue paper. "I wonder, Mr. Quill, whether you would permit me to take just one of these letters to read this evening. I promise you I shall return it untouched by morning, and I very much think, that it may tell us a good deal more than either of us yet understands." Roger hesitated only a moment before handing the topmost letter across. "I don't know what good it'll do, but I'll own it. I've no stomach left for reading them myself." It was as Miss Marple was folding the letter carefully into her handbag that she became aware, quite suddenly, of a sound from below. Not the bell above the shop door, which remained sealed still behind its police notice, but a softer sound, a footstep in the yard behind the building, quickly withdrawn, and then, a moment later, nothing at all but the settling fog pressing close against the small dark window of the box room. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Roger crossed to the window and looked down into the yard, where the last light was fading fast behind the mist. "There's no one there now," he said slowly, "but I'll swear something moved." Chapter 10. A Blow in the Dark. It was Constable Yardley, making his late round on the Friday night, who found Roger Quill lying at the foot of the box room stairs a little after 11 o'clock, a nasty gash above his temple, and the trunk in the room above rifled through with considerably less care than Miss Marple had shown it 2 evenings before. "He'll live, doctor says," Yardley reported to Inspector Bagshaw the following morning, in a voice that carried, despite his best efforts, a certain thin note of alarm, for a burglary was one thing in a village like Hollowmere, but a burglary in the very house where a poisoning had lately occurred was quite another, and Yardley, not yet 30, had begun to feel the case slipping rather further beyond his own competence than he cared to admit. "But he can't say who struck him. Heard someone on the stair. Went up to look, and that's the last he remembers till I found him. And the trunk? Turned near inside out, sir. The letters that is, Miss Marple, hadn't already been taken away and scattered all over the floor, and one of them's half burnt in the grate downstairs, like whoever did it meant to destroy the lot and was disturbed before they could finish." Bagshaw, a heavy-set man with the settled patience of an officer who had seen a good many village mysteries resolve themselves into disappointingly ordinary things, rubbed his jaw. "Someone's very anxious about what's in that trunk then, anxious enough to knock a man half senseless on a dark stair. That's not the act of a person with nothing to hide, Yardley, whatever else it is." The village, once the news broke, and it broke, as village news always did in Hollowmere, well before luncheon, settled with some relief upon Roger Quill himself as the likeliest author of his own misfortune, on the theory, murmured over garden walls and shop counters alike, that a man with debts in Portsmouth might easily have staged a burglary to explain away whatever he himself had removed, or that the trouble he had brought with him from the coast had finally caught up with him in the dark. Miss Marple did not think so, and said as much to her niece over the breakfast table on the Saturday, with a firmness that made Prue Hartnell pause, marmalade knife in hand. "A man does not generally strike himself over the head quite so hard as to require Dr. Enderby's attention for the better part of a day," she observed. "Nor does he burn a letter and leave the rest scattered where any constable might find them, if his object were truly to destroy the evidence rather than merely to search for one particular thing among a great many others he did not trouble himself with at all." "Then who, Aunt Jane?" "That," said Miss Marple, buttering her toast with rather more attention than the task required, "is what I mean to discover, though I confess I already have a very good notion, and I do not much like it." She thought, as she said it, of a slight, fair girl in a grey coat too heavy for mild weather, standing a little apart from the mourners at her aunt's own churchyard, her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that had struck Miss Marple, from the very first Sunday, as considerably more practised than grief alone could account for. Chapter 11. Sutton Marsh. Miss Marple returned to Ruth Pargeter's cottage on the Sunday afternoon, the letter from the trunk folded in her handbag, and this time she did not wait upon the choir mistress's talk of hymn books to find its own way round to silence before speaking. "I have read the letter, Miss Pargeter," she said, once she had been shown, with visible reluctance, into the small front parlour, the one addressed in Hester's own girlish hand, from a great many years before either of us knew her as she became. "It is addressed to you." Ruth Pargeter's sewing fell still in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and the clock on the mantel ticked on into a silence that seemed, to Miss Marple, to stretch a good deal further back than the few minutes it actually occupied. "Then you know," the choir mistress said at last, low, "or you very nearly do, and I may as well tell you the rest. since I don't imagine you're the sort of woman who lets a thing alone once she's got hold of the loose end of it. I generally find, Miss Marple said gently, that it is kinder to hear a thing told than to have it guessed at by degrees. Ruth Pargeter drew a long breath. We grew up together in Sutton Marsh, as I told you, closer than sisters, until we weren't. There was a man in those days, Daniel Averill, a farmer's son, and I were to marry him. We'd an understanding, though nothing formal. We were neither of us more than 19. And then Hester, she stopped, and began again, more steadily. Hester fell in love with him too, or thought she did, or he with her. I never rightly untangled which, and in the end it didn't much matter which of us he preferred, because within the year Hester was carrying his child, and Daniel Averill had already taken a passage to Canada, and never troubled to write to either of us again. And the child, a girl, born the following spring, in a house Hester's own mother found for her 2 villages off, where nobody knew the family and nobody would ask questions. Ruth Pargeter's hands, still holding the abandoned sewing, had begun very faintly to tremble. Hester couldn't keep her, not unmarried, not in those days, not with her own mother half mad with the shame of it already. The baby was given out to a family a little further off still, decent, quiet people, who wanted a child, and asked no questions of where she came from. Hester never told me their name. I don't believe she ever meant to tell anyone at all, for the rest of her life. And that, said Miss Marple quietly, was what came between 2 girls who had been closer than sisters. I loved him too, Miss Marple. God forgive me for a foolish girl's heart, and I never could look at Hester afterward without seeing what she'd taken from me, even though he'd have left me for Canada regardless, whatever she'd done or not done. We went our separate ways not long after. I came to Hollowmere first, as it happens, years before Hester ever thought to take the shop here, and when she followed, a widow by then, married and buried a husband I never met, I own I was surprised she'd choose the very village I'd already settled in. We were civil. We were never friends again. Ruth Pargeter looked up, and her sharp face had softened, for the first time since Miss Marple had known her, into something closer to plain sorrow. The girl would be 24 now, I should think, or thereabouts. I've wondered, now and again, whether I've passed her in the street without ever knowing it. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, the fenland light fading grey beyond the small parlour window, and thought of a girl of exactly that age, in a grey coat too heavy for mild weather, whose hands had lain folded in her lap at her aunt's own funeral, with a stillness that had never, from the very first Sunday, seemed to her entirely like grief. Chapter 12. What Averill Bryce Knew. You knew, Miss Marple said, without preamble, when Averill Bryce opened her own front door to find the old lady from the rectory lane standing upon the step in the last of the daylight, her umbrella furled, though the rain had not yet properly begun. You have known for some weeks, I think, exactly whose child Ivy Coswell really is. That is why you have looked so unlike yourself since the summer, and why you called on Hester nearly every evening this autumn, and why, when I asked you about old things having no bearing upon her death, you very nearly told me the truth and then thought better of it. For a moment, Averill Bryce stood quite motionless in her own doorway, and then, wordlessly, she stood back to let Miss Marple in. "How did you know," she said, when they were seated, her voice gone flat with a kind of exhausted relief, "that it was Ivy and not someone else? I have spent 6 weeks terrified that you or the inspector or someone would land upon it, and I should have to be the one to say her name aloud. A great many small things, none of them proof by themselves," said Miss Marple. "Her age, her stillness, which is the stillness of a person raised to make as little noise as possible in a house not entirely her own. Foster children very often carry it, my dear, whatever kindness they are shown, a sort of watchfulness that never quite leaves them. And the grey coat she wears, a size too heavy for her, which I noticed at the funeral and thought at the time was merely borrowed for mourning, though I wonder now whether it was not in fact her aunt's own coat, taken up rather suddenly this autumn from a woman who had begun, perhaps, to give her things she had never given before. Avril Bryce pressed a hand to her mouth. Hester decided in August. She'd had a fright with her heart in the summer. Nothing so serious as it seemed at the time, Dr. Frayne said, but it frightened her badly enough that she began to speak of things undone. She told me first, one evening at the shop, that she meant to write to the Coswells for the old papers. The fostering agreement, if you can call it that. Nothing legal, just an arrangement made privately all those years ago, and that she meant to tell Ivy the truth at last, and acknowledge her properly, publicly, before she died, and it was too late to be anything but a stranger's secret, and you counsel her against it. I begged her to wait, or to go about it gently at the very least, not simply to hand the girl a bundle of old letters and a photograph and expect her to make sense of 25 years of silence in an afternoon. Ivy is engaged, Miss Marple, though it isn't yet announced, to young Dr. Enderby, if you can believe it, and his family are the kind who set a very great store by respectability, Cannon's people, from Norwich. I don't say they'd have broken it off over an old scandal that was none of Ivy's own making, but Ivy herself. Ivy has spent her whole life being nobody's trouble, taking up as little room as she could, and I was afraid, dreadfully afraid, of what it would do to her to have the ground she stood on shift all at once, in front of the very family she hoped to marry into. Did Miss Quill heed your warning? Avril Bryce shook her head slowly. She said she'd waited 25 years already, and that she meant to be the one to tell it, in her own time and her own way, before someone else did it for her, or before she died and left it undone forever. She'd asked the Coswells to send the papers on. I believe they arrived only a few days before she died. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. I don't know if Ivy ever saw them, Miss Marple. I have prayed every night since then, but I don't think my prayers were answered, do you? Miss Marple, looking at the empty grate and the rain now beginning, at last, to streak the darkening window, did not think they had been answered either. Chapter 13. A Question of Sugar. Miss Marple invited Ivy Coswell to tea on the Monday, in the small sitting room of the rectory cottage that Prue had given over to her aunt's use, and took care to arrange it as an ordinary kindness, rather than an interview. The old lady from the lane, comforting the bereaved young woman with a pot of China tea and a plate of shortbread, precisely the sort of small attention the village would expect of her and think nothing further about. Ivy came in her grey coat, as she always did now, and sat very upright in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, and thanked Miss Marple for the tea in the same quiet, contained voice she had used at the inquest, at the funeral, in every appearance she had made before the village since her aunt's death. "You have borne all this so bravely," Miss Marple said, pouring out. "It is a very great deal for anyone to carry, the shop to see to, the police coming and going, poor Mr. Quill laid up with his head, and grief besides, which is heavy enough on its own account, without all the rest of it piled atop. I manage, Miss Marple." Ivy accepted her cup, with hands that were, Miss Marple noted, entirely steady. "One mustn't one? Aunt Hester always said there was no sense making a show of feeling what one felt. Better to keep busy, a very sensible philosophy, though not always an easy one to live by." Miss Marple offered the shortbread and let a small silence settle, comfortable and unhurried, before she went on, in precisely the tone she might have used to remark upon the weather. "I had occasion the other day to look through an old trunk in the box room above the shop, at Mr. Quill's kind invitation. Such a quantity of old things one keeps, isn't it strange? Letters, photographs, all manner of small treasures from a life nobody else quite remembers the shape of. I found the oddest thing among it all, a little silver frame, quite empty, though the mark inside showed plainly enough that a photograph had sat there for a great many years and been taken out only very recently. I have wondered ever since what became of it, and who might have taken it, and why." She had not, in all her long years of noticing such things, seen a reaction come and go so quickly, nor so completely fail to be hidden in time. Ivy Coswell's hand, lifting her cup to her lips, checked itself for the barest fraction of a second, and in that fraction her other hand rose, entirely without her own leave, to the collar of her blouse, where a fine chain disappeared beneath the fabric, and pressed there, flat against her throat, as a person presses a hand to a wound to keep it from being seen. It was gone again almost as soon as it had happened. Ivy set down her cup with perfect composure and said, in a voice only very slightly less steady than before, "How curious. I'm sure I couldn't say, Miss Marple. Aunt Hester never let me near that trunk in all the years I worked for her. It was quite the one thing in the shop I wasn't permitted to touch." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently, and passed the shortbread again, and let the subject fall away into talk of the weather and the coming frost, and whether the Garden Society would have trouble holding its postponed vote before Christmas after all. But she had seen what she had seen, and she thought, watching Ivy Coswell walk away down the lane afterward in her aunt's heavy grey coat, with a chain about her throat that held something she could not bear to have found, that there was very little left now to discover, and a great deal, still, that would have to be gently, carefully said aloud. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Locket. It rained hard that night, the first real rain of the autumn, drumming on the rectory roof until nearly dawn, and Miss Marple lay a long while awake, turning over in her mind not the puzzle of the case, which she believed she had very nearly solved, but the harder question of what was owed, in kindness as much as in justice, to a girl who had spent her whole short life being nobody's trouble. She thought of the humbug left half-wrapped upon the counter, and understood it now for what it almost certainly was, not evidence of surprise, but evidence of ordinariness, of an evening beginning exactly as every other evening had begun, right up until the moment it did not. She thought of the broken lock on the writing desk, forced not by a stranger, but by someone who knew precisely which drawer to force, and precisely what it held. She thought of the empty frame, and the chain at Ivy Coswell's throat, and the phrase Miss Alcott had reported from the Garden Society meeting, "Somebody in this village at last," and not just the woman who sells the humbugs, and understood that to have been the sound of a woman screwing up, at 61, the courage to claim a daughter she had given away at 19, and she thought, with a sorrow that surprised her by its weight, of a girl raised always to take up as little room as possible, who had discovered, in the space of a single autumn, that the aunt who had given her a home was in fact her mother, that the mother who had given her away meant now to say so to the entire village, and that the young man she hoped to marry came from a family who set great store by precisely the kind of respectability such a revelation would have shattered beyond any mending. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, an excuse. It had never, in all her years of watching human nature at its most desperate, been an excuse. But it was, she thought, an explanation, and there was a difference between the two that she had found, over a long life, mattered a very great deal. She rose before Prue the next morning, and walked, in the last thinning mist of the season, down to the shop, where Inspector Bagshaw had granted Roger Quill leave to reopen for the sale of stamps and postal orders, though not yet of sweets, and found Ivy Coswell already there behind the counter, arranging the till with the same exact, orderly habits her aunt had once shown. "I wonder, my dear," Miss Marple said, "whether you would take tea with me once more this afternoon. There is something I would like to show you, and something I think, perhaps, you have been waiting a very long while for someone to ask you about directly, rather than talking around." Ivy Coswell's hands went still upon the till drawer. For a long moment she did not answer at all, and the shop clock ticked on into the silence between them, and Miss Marple watched something in the girl's carefully guarded face begin, at last, very quietly, to give way. "Yes," Ivy said finally, so low it was scarcely more than breath. "Yes, I think perhaps I have." Chapter 15. Tea for two. Ivy Coswell came to the rectory cottage at 4 o'clock, punctual to the minute, as she was in all things, and sat once more in the chair by the window, while Miss Marple poured the tea with hands that betrayed nothing of the weight of what was about to be said between them. "I am not going to ask you a great many clever questions, my dear," Miss Marple said, setting down the teapot, "because I think you have been asked quite enough questions these past weeks by people who did not truly wish to hear the answers, only to have their own theories confirmed. I am going to tell you what I believe to be true, and you may correct me wherever I have got it wrong, and I promise you I shall not think less of you for any of it, whatever it turns out to be." Ivy said nothing, but her hands, folded in her lap, had begun very faintly to tremble, the first sign of unsteadiness Miss Marple had seen in her since the whole affair began. "I believe," Miss Marple went on gently, "that some weeks ago, in September, I should think, not long after your aunt began her sudden and rather startling campaign for the Garden Society, you came upon something in the shop that you were never meant to find. A letter, perhaps, or the corner of a document, enough to make you curious, and curiosity, once it has taken hold, is a very hard thing to set down again unread. I believe you forced the lock of that desk drawer yourself, not a stranger, and found there enough to understand that the aunt who raised you was, in fact, your own mother, and that she meant, before very much longer, to say so to the entire village, to the Garden Society, to the rectory, to Dr. Enderby's family in Norwich, to everyone whose good opinion you had spent your whole life quietly, carefully earning." The trembling in Ivy's hands had spread now to her voice, though she had not yet spoken. "How did you know about the drawer?" "The wood around the screw was still pale, where the lock had been forced," said Miss Marple. "Your aunt was not a woman who left broken things unmended. It could only have happened very shortly before she died, and it could only sensibly have been done by someone with a reason to search that particular drawer rather than any other in the shop." She paused. "I believe, too, that you took the photograph from the little silver frame in the trunk upstairs on some later visit, perhaps to be quite certain of what you had already guessed, to see the man's face, or your mother's young face, and know beyond any doubting that the story was true, and I believe you have worn it since, on a chain about your neck, where no one could see it but you." Very slowly, without a word, Ivy Coswell reached up and drew the fine chain out from beneath her collar. At the end of it hung a small oval locket, and when she opened it with fingers that shook now quite openly, there lay inside a tiny photograph, cut down to fit, of a young woman with Hester Quill's own eyes, laughing at something beyond the frame, in a world that had existed a great many years before the sugar twist, before Hollowmere, before any of it. "She meant to tell everyone," Ivy said, and her carefully contained voice broke at last, all in a rush, like a dam giving way after being too long and too carefully held. "She told me herself 3 weeks before she died, called me into the back room one evening after closing and told me straight out, no softening it at all, that she was my mother, that she'd given me away at a fortnight old because she'd no choice in it then, and that she meant to make it right now, before God and the whole village, whatever it cost either of us. She said she'd waited 25 years to be brave enough, and she wasn't going to wait any longer, and you begged her not to. I went down on my knees to her, Miss Marple, if you want the plain truth of it. Not for my own sake only, though God forgive me, that was a great part of it, thinking of Andrew's people and what they'd say, Cannon's people, and how carefully I'd have to be presented to them, how carefully everything had to go if I wasn't to shame him with what I was. But for hers too, in a way. She'd built a whole life here on being nobody's trouble, same as I had. Hester Quill, the quiet woman who sold humbugs and never put a foot wrong. I couldn't see what good it would do either of us, tearing all that down at 61, just to satisfy some notion of being somebody she'd got into her head all of a sudden. But she would not be dissuaded. Ivy shook her head, and 2 tears, the first Miss Marple had seen her shed in the whole course of the affair, slid down her face, and she did not trouble to wipe them away. She said I'd understand one day, when I was old enough to know what it cost a woman to spend her whole life being ashamed of the one good thing she'd ever made. She said that to me, Miss Marple, the one good thing she'd ever made, meaning me, and I couldn't bear it. Do you understand? I couldn't bear to be loved like that, and ruined by it, in the very same breath. So you went out to the garden bed behind the shop, Miss Marple said, very quietly now, where the monk's hood grows, and you knew, I think, exactly what part of the plant to take and how to prepare it. because your aunt kept an old herbal among her books, the kind every village shopkeeper keeps for making up simple remedies, and it would have told you plainly enough what not to touch with bare hands, and what a very little of it, taken in tea, would do. I told myself for 3 days I wouldn't do it, Ivy whispered. I told myself I'd find some other way to make her see reason, and then on Tuesday I made the tea the same as always, at 5:30, and I put it in, and I told myself even then I could still pour it away before I left, and I didn't. I put the pot down in front of her, and I said good evening, same as I said every evening, and I went home, and I let her drink it alone. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire settled in the grate, and somewhere beyond the window a dog barked once, far off, and fell silent. "And the box room," Miss Marple said at last, gently. "Mr. Quill struck down upon the stairs." I went back for the rest of the letters. I couldn't bear the thought of them lying about for anyone to find, for Roger to read, or the inspector, or you. A faint, broken ghost of a smile touched Ivy's mouth. Especially you, I think, though I couldn't have said why at the time. I heard him coming up behind me before I'd finished, and I panicked, and I struck him with the poker from the grate, and I have not slept a whole night since, wondering whether I'd killed him too, and knowing I very well might have, and that I should have deserved it if I had. Miss Marple reached across and took the girl's cold, trembling hand in both of her own, and held it there a moment before she spoke again. "I am not going to pretend to you, my dear, that what you have done can be set right by any words of mine, or that it ought to be excused, because it cannot, and I think you know that better than I could tell you. A woman is dead who loved you, whatever else is true, and a young man was very nearly killed besides. But I will tell you this. I do not think you are a wicked person, Ivy Coswell. I think you are a very frightened one, who was asked to bear, in the space of a single autumn, a weight that would have bent a great many older and steadier people quite out of shape, and who broke under it in the worst possible way a person can break. That is not the same as wickedness, though the law, I fear, will not trouble itself greatly with the distinction. What happens now?" Ivy's voice was very small. "Now," said Miss Marple, rising and crossing to the window, where Inspector Bagshaw's car stood waiting, as she had known it would, at the end of the lane. "I think you must tell Inspector Bagshaw exactly what you have told me, in your own words, and let the law take its course, which is a hard thing to say to you, my dear, but a kinder one, in the end, than letting an innocent man go on being suspected in your place, or letting this village live for years under the shadow of a mystery never properly closed." Ivy Coswell sat a moment longer, the locket still open in her lap, her mother's young, laughing face looking up at her from a world that no longer existed, and then she rose, quite steadily, and reached for her coat. "I should like to keep this," she said, closing the locket gently, and holding it in her closed fist. "Whatever happens, it's the only picture I have of her as she was, before any of it went wrong." "I don't imagine anyone will begrudge you that," said Miss Marple. Chapter 16. The Inspector Wants It Plain. Inspector Bagshaw was not, by his own admission, a man given to patience with what he called the delicate way of putting things, and so it fell to Miss Marple, 2 days later, sitting once more in the small back room of the Sugar Twist, with the shop clock ticking through the wall, and Roger Quill, his head still bandaged but his colour much improved, listening quietly from the doorway, to lay the whole of it out for him in the plain, orderly fashion he preferred. "You'll forgive me, madam, if I say it still wants a good deal of explaining," Bagshaw said, notebook open on his knee, though Ivy Coswell's own signed statement lay already in the folder at his elbow. "The girls told us what she did and why, plain enough, and I don't doubt a word of it. But I own I don't yet see how you came to it before we did, working from nothing more than an old lady's tea parties and a bit of garden talk." "It was never really one thing, Inspector," Miss Marple said, folding her hands in her lap in a manner that Roger Quill, watching from the door, thought looked oddly uncomfortably like the way Ivy herself so often sat. "It was a great many very small things, none of them worth troubling a policeman with on their own account, but adding up, taken together, to something a good deal more solid than any single clue could have been. Such as, madam? Such as a humbug left half-wrapped upon the counter, which told me that whatever happened to Miss Quill happened suddenly, in the middle of an entirely ordinary evening, and not after any quarrel or confrontation that might have interrupted her at some other task, which meant in turn that whoever poisoned her had not needed to force a scene at all, but had only to hand her a cup of tea already prepared, exactly as happened every evening of her working life, and walk away before it took effect. That told me the poison went into the tea before it was ever poured, most likely while it was being made, rather than being slipped in afterward under cover of some argument, which narrowed the matter very considerably to the one person who made that tea each day and left before her mistress drank it. That points to the girl plainly enough, I'll grant you, said Bagshaw. But it might have pointed to poisoned leaves in the caddy itself, open to anyone who came and went in that back room. It might have, except that Miss Quill made her own tea on Sundays, when the shop was closed, and Miss Coswell not there at all, and if the caddy itself had been tampered with, I think we may be fairly confident she would not have survived to the following Tuesday. No, it had to be the tea prepared for her on that particular evening, by the one person who prepared it, which is a very much smaller net to cast than a whole tin of leaves anyone might have reached. Bagshaw made a note, unhurried. Go on, madam. Then there was the broken lock on the writing desk, forced, as I told you at the very first, not gently and not very long before Miss Quill died, which told me someone close to the shop, someone who knew exactly which drawer to force, had gone looking for something specific and found it. And there was Miss Alcott's account of Hester Quill's sudden determination, this autumn, to be somebody in this village at last, and not just the woman who sells the humbugs, an odd phrase for a woman who had never before shown the smallest interest in being anything more than she already was, and one that spoke, to my ear, of a person newly resolved upon some large and overdue act of honesty, the sort of resolve that comes, very often, to people who have begun at last to reckon seriously with their own mortality. And the trunk, and the empty frame within it, told me that whatever Hester Quill was resolving to be honest about some matter, buried a very long way back in her own history, kept locked away quite literally for years, and disturbed only this autumn. Once Miss Pargeter told me the story of Sutton Marsh, and of a child given away 25 years before. The shape of the whole thing became, I am afraid, very much clearer than I should have liked it to be. For it is one thing to solve a puzzle, Inspector, and quite another to discover that the solution is a frightened girl of 24, rather than some hardened stranger with no claim upon one's sympathy at all. And the locket confirmed it. The locket confirmed it, Miss Marple agreed, though I confess I had very little real doubt left by the time I asked Ivy to tea a second time. A person does not clutch at her own throat, Inspector, quite unconsciously, at the mention of an empty photograph frame, unless she knows a great deal more about what was once inside it than she cares to say aloud. Bagshaw closed his notebook at last, and looked, for the first time since the case had begun, rather more troubled than satisfied, in the manner of a man who has got the answer he came for and finds it a good deal less comfortable than the not knowing had been. It's a bad business all round, he said. The old lady's dead, and the girl'll answer for it, and none of it need have happened at all if Hester Quill had only left well enough alone and kept her secret buried where it had lain for 25 years already. I wonder, Inspector, said Miss Marple, rather more gently than she generally permitted herself to correct an officer of the law, whether that is quite the moral to draw from it. It seems to me that Hester Quill did a very brave thing, in the end, however badly it turned out for her. She chose, at 61, to stop being ashamed of the truest, most human thing she had ever done, rather than go on hiding it until she died and took the secret with her. It was not her honesty that killed her. It was the fear her honesty woke up in someone who had spent her whole life being taught, by circumstance if not by any unkindness of Miss Quill's own making, that the truth about herself was a shameful thing to be kept locked in a drawer. I think the tragedy lies there, Inspector, and not in Miss Quill's courage at all. Roger Quill, still in the doorway, said nothing, but his hand went unconsciously to the bandage at his temple, and his face, when Miss Marple glanced toward him, wore the look of a man turning over a thought he had not expected to have. Chapter 17. What the village made of it. It was a fortnight before the assizes were fixed, and in that time Hollowmere did what villages have always done, with tragedies too large and too near to be comfortably absorbed all at once. It talked endlessly, from the sluice gate to the church porch to the queue outside the temporary post office counter set up in the rectory hall, while the Sugar Twist stood shuttered and the question of its future undecided. Some said Ivy Coswell had always had a strange, still way about her that nobody had properly trusted. Not really, whatever kindness they had shown her at the time. It is a peculiarity of village memory that it reshapes itself very readily around whatever the ending turns out to be, so that a girl who had been, for 6 years, universally described as quiet and biddable and no trouble to anyone, became, within a fortnight of her arrest, a girl who had always given people a queer feeling, if only they had thought to mention it before. Others were kinder, and said what Miss Marple privately believed to be nearer the truth, that a girl raised in ignorance of her own history and then handed the whole of it, unprepared, in the space of a single autumn evening, might be forgiven a great deal that could never, in fairness, be forgiven outright, though forgiveness and the law, as Miss Marple had told the inspector, were very rarely the same conversation. Averil Bryce gave evidence at the trial, quietly and with evident grief, of Hester Quill's plan and of her own failed attempts to counsel patience, and afterward she called upon Miss Marple at the rectory to say, with the particular exhausted honesty of a woman who has carried a secret past the point of bearing it alone, that she did not know whether she should ever entirely forgive herself for not finding some better way to prevent what had happened, though she knew, in her more reasonable moments, that she could not fairly have foreseen it. You could not have prevented what you did not know had already gone so far, my dear, Miss Marple told her, over tea that had, for once, gone rather cold between them while they talked. Hester made her choice in September, and Ivy made hers in October, and both choices were made, in the end, by grown women acting upon their own hearts, however much any of us might wish we had stood between them and the consequences. Guilt of that kind is a very natural thing to feel, but it is not, I think, an accurate one. Ruth Pargeter, for her part, did not speak of the matter again to Miss Marple after their conversation in the small front parlour, but she took, in the weeks that followed, to visiting the shuttered Sugar Twist alone in the evenings, standing before its dark window for some minutes at a time before walking on, and the village, watching her go, began at last to murmur a rather different and considerably older story than the one it had settled on before, of 2 girls in Sutton Marsh who had once been closer than sisters, and of a grief that had waited 25 years to find itself, at last, with nowhere left to go but into the open. Roger Quill kept the shop, in the end, once the estate was settled, for Hester Quill, it emerged, had left what little she had, entirely to Ivy, in a will drawn up, with grim and terrible irony, only that September, and the courts had a great deal to say about whether a convicted party might inherit from the woman she had killed, so that the matter passed, eventually, sideways to Roger, as the only other family the law could readily identify. He reopened the Sugar Twist the following spring, and kept, upon the counter, a small dish of humbugs wrapped always in white paper, though he never again, in all the years he ran the shop, took his tea alone behind the till after closing, but carried his cup instead to the front step, whatever the weather, and drank it there in the open air. Chapter 18. The threads left hanging there remained. Even after the assizes had done their grim and necessary work, a handful of smaller matters that Hollowmere required to see properly tied off before it could consider the affair, at last, truly closed. For a village, Miss Marple had long observed, does not let a story rest merely because its central question has been answered. It must first account for every minor character as well, or the tale will nag at it for years. Silas Trent, cleared from the first of any real suspicion once Ivy's confession made plain the timing and manner of the poisoning, found himself, rather to his own surprise, treated with considerably more sympathy by the village than he had known before the whole affair began, for it had come out, in the course of the investigation, that the £40 he had borrowed from Hester Quill had gone not to any vice or folly, as the gossip had darkly hinted, but to settle his widowed mother's debts in Lynn, a fact he had been too proud to mention, while it might have looked like pleading for mercy, and too honest to deny, once it no longer mattered whether anyone believed him. He paid the debt in full, in the end, to Roger Quill as Hester's heir, a full year earlier than the original terms had required, and took to nodding to Miss Marple quite civilly whenever they passed in the lane, as a man does to someone who once thought the worst of him, and had, in the end, the grace to think better. Miss Prudence Alcott retained the chairmanship of the Garden Society without a contest the following spring, the postponed vote never having been revived, and told Miss Marple, over tea some months later, that she had found, rather to her own discomfort, that winning without a fight had given her considerably less satisfaction than she had expected, and that she had come, in a strange roundabout way, to respect the dead woman who had challenged her rather more than she had liked her while she lived. She only wanted to be somebody, in the end, Miss Alcott said, turning her teacup thoughtfully in her hands. I don't know that I ever properly understood, before all this, how very hard some people have to work, simply to be allowed to be somebody at all. And Dr. Enderby, young, earnest Dr. Enderby, who had been the first to insist the smell in that back room was not right, and whose own quiet understanding with Ivy Coswell had never, in the end, been formally announced to anyone, closed his practice in Hollowmere within the year and took up a position, it was said, in a hospital some considerable distance to the north, where nobody troubled to ask him why a promising young locum had left so good a country practice so abruptly, or why he wrote, twice a month without fail for as long as anyone in the village continued to notice such things, to an address that Miss Marple, who made it her business to notice such things rather longer than most, privately suspected belonged to a women's prison a good deal further south than his new position required him to travel. He never said a word against her the whole time, Prue Hartnell remarked to her aunt, not long before Miss Marple's visit to Hollowmere drew to its natural close. I always thought that rather remarkable, given everything. I do not think it remarkable at all, said Miss Marple. I think it is very often the truest test of what a person feels for another, not what is said while the world is watching, but what continues, quietly, once the world has grown tired of watching and moved on to some fresher trouble. Chapter 19. The Last Cup of Tea. On the morning Miss Marple was to leave Hollowmere for her visit to her niece, prolonged well beyond its original fortnight by the demands of the case, could not in decency be stretched any further, and St. Mary Mead, she had begun to feel, must surely be wondering by now what had become of her. She walked once more down the High Street, past the Sugar Twist with its blinds now drawn up and its little brass bell restored to its proper cheerful ring above the door, and stopped, on impulse, to buy a quarter of the sharp humbugs Prue had so lamented losing, from Roger Quill himself, standing rather awkwardly behind the counter his aunt had occupied for 11 years. "Business is picking up, Miss Marple," he said, weighing out the sweets with hands that had grown, in the months since his recovery, a good deal steadier than they had been that first bewildered week. "Slowly. People will come back to a shop, in time, whatever's happened in it. I don't know that they ever quite forget, but they come back all the same. I suppose that's a kind of forgiveness, in its way, even if nobody ever says the word." "I think it very often is," Miss Marple agreed, accepting her twist of white paper. "Villages have long memories, Mr. Quill, but they have, on the whole, forgiving hearts as well, provided one gives them time enough to let the two work themselves out together." She thought of this, walking back to the rectory with the fenland mist already beginning to gather, thin and silver, along the ditches for what would be, this year, one of the last mornings of proper autumn fog before the frost set in hard and the fields turned white instead of grey, thought of Hester Quill, who had spent 25 years being ashamed of the truest thing she had ever done, and had found, at 61, the courage to stop, only to discover that courage, once loosed into a frightened heart not her own, can do quite as much damage as any lie ever told to protect itself. And she thought of Ivy Coswell, who had spent her whole short life learning to take up as little room as possible in a world she had never been given reason to trust, and who had broken in the end, not from wickedness, but from the particular, terrible weight of being loved, all at once, more openly than she had ever known how to bear. "It is a very great pity," she said aloud to Prue, over their last breakfast together, "that people so rarely manage to be brave and kind in the same moment." Hester Quill was brave at the very end, but she was not, I think, quite kind enough in the manner of it. She thought of her own long-buried need to be honest before she thought sufficiently of what the truth, arriving so suddenly, might do to a girl who had never been prepared to receive it. And Ivy Coswell might, perhaps, have found some kindness in herself for her own mother's courage, if only she had not been quite so frightened for her own small, hard-won place in the world to make room for it. "You make it sound almost as though neither of them was truly wicked, Aunt Jane," Prue said, buttering her toast. "Only unlucky and unequal to what was asked of them. I do not think very many people are truly wicked, my dear, in the way the newspapers like to suggest," Miss Marple said, folding her napkin with the same quiet, exact precision she had brought to every small task throughout her stay. "I think most people are only ordinary, capable of a very great deal of both love and harm, very often within the very same week, sometimes within the very same hour, and that murder, when it comes generally not from some rare and monstrous defect of character, but from an entirely ordinary fear pushed, by circumstance, a very great deal further than it was ever meant to travel. It is not a comfortable thought, but I have found, over a long life of watching such things unfold in villages very like this one, that it is, on the whole, the truest one available to us." She rose from the table, gathered her gloves, and looked out through the window at the last of the mist, lifting slowly from the green, thin and silver, and already beginning, here and there, to let the pale autumn sun through in patches, and thought, not for the first time, that a village was very rarely so quiet, nor so simple as it first appeared to a stranger passing through, and that the sweetest shops very often kept their bitterest secrets locked away in the smallest, most ordinary of drawers, waiting only for someone patient enough and willing enough to ask the right small question at the right small moment. Chapter 20. The train at Lynn. The branch line from Hollowmere ran, in those days, only twice on a weekday morning, and Miss Marple, waiting on the small wind-swept platform with her case at her feet, and Prue fussing over whether she had remembered her umbrella, found herself thinking not of murder at all in those last quiet minutes, but of the particular ordinary kindness with which the village had already begun, in its own slow fashion, to knit itself back together. Mrs. Dance had sent a jar of her cottage marmalade for the journey, pressed into Prue's hands the evening before with the brisk insistence of a woman who did not know how else to say that she was sorry to see the visit end under such circumstances, and glad, all the same, that it had ended at all. Constable Yardley, passing the station on his morning round, had stopped to touch his helmet to her and say, with the particular gravity of a young man who has learned a hard lesson rather sooner in his career than he expected to, that he hoped she would think kindly of Hollowmere despite everything, and that he, for his part, had learned a very great deal from watching how she went about her quiet questions, and meant to go about his own rather differently from now on. "You gave that boy more confidence in a fortnight than 3 years on the Ipswich force managed," Prue observed, as they watched him walk on down the lane. "I don't know how you do it, Aunt Jane." "I do very little, my dear," Miss Marple said. "I only listen rather longer than most people trouble to, and ask a great many small questions that do not, on their own, seem to matter very much at all. It is astonishing what people will tell you, quite freely, once they have decided you are too old and too harmless to be worth guarding themselves against. There was no bitterness in the observation, only a certain wry, settled amusement, the amusement of a woman who had made her peace, long ago, with being underestimated, and had found it, on the whole, a very useful thing to be. The train, when it came, was small and slow, and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and Miss Marple settled herself into a window seat, with her case stowed safely above, and looked out, as the fenland began at last to slide past the glass, at the flat, wide fields still silvered here and there with the last of the morning mist, at the dykes running arrow-straight toward a horizon that seemed, in that low grey light, to have no proper edge at all. She thought of Hester Quill, who had kept a shop for 11 years and a secret for 25, and who had died, in the end, not for any wickedness of her own, but for the very human, very ordinary courage of refusing, at last, to be ashamed any longer of the truest thing she had ever done. She thought of Ivy Coswell, who would spend a great many years now paying, in the coldest and most formal way the law knew how to exact payment, for a single evening's terrible failure of nerve, and who would carry, whatever else the years brought her, a small silver locket with a young woman's laughing face inside it, the one unbroken piece of a mother she had been given only long enough to lose twice over. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, watching the fens give way slowly to hedgerows and the first scattered outskirts of a larger town, a story with any very comfortable moral to offer a listener hoping for one. There was no villain in it easily hated, no victim entirely without her own share of blame for how badly the truth, once lost, had gone. There was only, as there so very often was, an ordinary woman's ordinary fear, grown large enough in the dark to do a terrible thing, and a village left afterward to go on with its flower shows and its choir practice, and its small daily transactions of sugar and stamps, a little wiser perhaps, and a very great deal sadder for having learned exactly how much an outwardly quiet place could be hiding, all along, behind its most unremarkable counter. She closed her eyes, at last, as the train gathered speed toward Lynn and the connection that would carry her home to St. Mary Mead, and thought, with the particular tired satisfaction of a long task honestly finished, that human nature, whatever else might be said of it, was never quite so simple as a village liked to believe on any ordinary Tuesday morning, and that it was very often the sweetest seeming things, kept longest and most carefully behind glass, that held, in the end, the bitterest history of all. Coda. Some months later, a letter reached St. Mary Mead in Prue Hartnell's round, cheerful hand, tucked between an account of the vicarage fete and a complaint about the new organist's tempo, mentioning almost as an afterthought that the monk's hood bed behind the sugar twist had been dug up entirely that spring, at Roger Quill's own quiet insistence, and planted over instead with nothing more dangerous than sweet William and stocks, so that by June the whole narrow strip of ground behind the shop was, for the first time in anyone's memory, simply and uncomplicatedly pretty, with nothing at all growing in it that a person needed to be careful of. Miss Marple read the letter twice through at her own breakfast table, over toast that wanted rather more butter than her housekeeper generally allowed her, and thought that it was, in its own small and unremarkable way, as fitting an ending as the whole strange business could have been given, for it is not always the largest gestures. She reflected, folding the letter away at last into her writing desk among a great many others very like it, that mark a village's slow, imperfect return to its ordinary self, but very often the smallest ones, a border dug over, a bell rung again above a shop door, a cup of tea carried out, from that day forward, to be drunk in the open air. She thought, too, of a question Bagshaw had put to her on that last afternoon in the shop's back room, almost as an aside, gathering up his notebook and his folder of statements, whether she had ever, in all her quiet questioning, felt any doubt at all that it was Ivy, and not some other, more obvious suspect, who had done the thing. She had told him, quite truthfully, that she had felt a great deal of doubt, and had gone on feeling it nearly to the very end. For that, she said, was very often the shape a true answer took in a case of this kind. Not a sudden certainty arriving all at once, like a lamp lit in a dark room, but a slow accumulation of small, ordinary facts, each one unremarkable by itself, each one perfectly capable of an innocent explanation, until the moment came when they could no longer, taken altogether, be explained away as anything but what they were. It was, she thought now, folding Prue's letter away for the last time and reaching for her own pen to begin a reply, very much the way of human nature in general, and not only of murder, that the truth about a person, however carefully hidden, generally revealed itself not in one dramatic gesture, but in 100 small, unguarded ones, a hand rising to a throat, a lock forced and never mended, a phrase spoken once and never quite explained, and that a listener patient enough to notice all of them, and kind enough not to look away, would very often find that the answer had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting only to be properly asked.